G'day, I'm Joseph Hatteran. This is my ACR204 online presentation on Jean Lee execution. Born in 1919 in Dubbo, New South Wales, Jean Lee had a fairly stable upbringing until her late teens when she ran away from home. She worked a few nothing jobs, but met a pimp in her late 20s and was pushed into prostitution. A couple of years later, she met with a professional criminal who'd just be out of jail and future accomplice Robert David Clayton, who directed her down a path of petty crimes, including robbery. She was often used as bait in some of their petty crimes. She would go to a bar full of drunk men and convince them to come back to her to a vulnerable place, whether this be a car or a hotel room. She would attract them with the promise of sex, and before nearing the event, she would try to rob the man. If they resisted, Clayton would join her and bash or do anything to steal their money. It would be effective on the deterrence of speaking out, as ridicule from the victim's partner or family was strong enough to keep him quiet. This method was particularly effective, and it continued to the night of the major crime. So the night of the crime, Jean Lee and two accomplices, both of criminal backgrounds, botch a robbery of bookmaker William Kent, who was 73 at the time. In an attempt to find the whereabouts of his wealth, Kent was tortured, bashed and ultimately strangled to death in his Carlton home. Lee and her male accomplices, including David Clayton, were convicted 6 months later guilty of murder and all sentenced to death. This was historic and big news, as no woman had been hung in Victoria for 56 years, and this has remained to the present. Print media at the time saw human interest crime stories become a staple of the papers at the time. So the night of the crime, So the media first published stories on this case 3 days later following the murder. Mainstream media was timely in its reporting, and it ran fairly fact-based timeline of what happened on the night, as per the police. As you can see, the Herald Sun ran the story on page 1, The Age on page 3, and Argus on page 8, indicating a pretty high importance or high newsworthiness of this case. So, trial and conviction. The trial was heavily covered. Updates a couple of weeks later by all 3 major publications were present. The case drew substantial public attention, and details and the timelines were coming to a head in these publications. As more information arose, more public interest grew. A lot of the information at this time was through police reports and eyewitnesses to the conversations the perpetrators and the police had. In Argus on December 1st, they quoted saying, "Kent's pockets had been turned out, every drawer in the room gone through, and furniture broken. Kent's hands were tied behind his back." Argus here presenting a fairly descriptive portrayal of the event as they knew at the time. Social significance of the case. Jean Lee being a woman, no woman had been hung in Australia for 56 years at this time. Talk developed of the death penalty for all 3 of them, and public reaction to the fact that Lee was up for the death penalty became the focus of most of the reporting. The article above, "I Hit an Old Man," published on the 3rd of November in the Herald, is headlined by a Lee quote. This is a clear indication that status as a woman, Lee was the most newsworthy aspect of the story. The article actually includes equal focus on all 3 perpetrators, but begins and is headlined by Lee, indicating a very high importance on her being a woman. As time progressed, opinion on the case began to be published in the newspaper. Jean Lee being the subject, she divided opinion greatly. There were many who thought she should be spared because she was a woman, or some asked the question, does she deserve the same fate as her male counterparts? 56-year gap between a woman getting hung and Jean was quite significant. You can see Nick Claremont put a short opinion piece in the paper. He says, "Why all the fuss over the intended hanging of murderous Jean Lee? A person who breaks the law must be prepared to take the consequences. The fact that no woman has been hung in Victoria for 50 years, or that a political party doesn't approve, should be no deterrent to the course of justice. Let's not be squeamish. She must take her punishment." This was only one side of the story. Many defenders came out to Lee, as we will discuss later on. As the case came to an ending, the public, all the way from your Joe Blow to the politicians at the high end, had their opinion on the issue. We see a senior cabinet minister asked the cabinet to reprieve Lee on mercy grounds because she was a woman. It was a nationwide debate. Ultimately, none of the protesting efforts that came from cabinet ministers, aggrieved women, the Labour Women's Organising Committee were enough to change the verdict. Jean Lee had been sentenced to death. In anticipation of the fateful day where Jean Lee would be murdered, a week leading into it, papers released rather extensive biographies and life accounts of Lee. Big spreads with pictures put together by whole divisions of writers. Lee's story was a huge deal. People wanted to know who Jean Lee was. They were seen in the Courier Mail. It says, "From our Melbourne staff." So it was collated by the whole newsroom. It was such a newsworthy story. The actual execution was a landmark day. It was extensively covered. Writers describing the scene descriptively, while highlighting the human aspects of the event, the human aspects of how Lee behaved, and her accomplices, how they were calm, somewhat resigned to the fact that they were going to die. They weren't causing a ruckus. Jean Lee never awoke from a drugged sleep, was the heading in the Mirror. They described her before the execution. Lee was dressed in a pale yellow skirt and jumper. Her hands had been handcuffed in front of her, both legs bound together, and the head and face were concealed by a large white hood. They really putting the reader in that jail where the execution happened, when only 20 or so people were able to see it. The Illawarra Daily Mercury said bells began to toll, signifying that the execution had taken place, but the sound of the bells was drowned outside by the jail by the sound of planes passing overhead. Extremely descriptive, extremely based on location, setting the scene. This was the reporting of the execution. The historic significance of Jean Lee is seen in the aftermath. Plenty of literature, 2 different books, biographies were written in the wake of her execution. She was the first woman to be hung in 55 years at the time, and most probably the last here in Australia. In a book by poet Geordie Albertson, Lee was quoted about the crime. Norman Mead killed him while Bobby walked up Lygon on the street. This photo here of a young, attractive Jean Lee, the image was so significant because it was indicative of her crimes. She used her beauty to lure potential victims. It's what made her a good criminal, because it was so effective. It also displays massive contrast to the evil act she committed that night to Mr. Kent. In our second book, on the right hand side, you can see that same photo plastered about 5 different times. It was so powerful because it was just the polar opposite to what she did on that night. And that's my references. Thank you for listening.